Hi everyone and welcome to our webinar. We're going to get started now very shortly. I want to welcome you all to this inaugural webinar in the Reimagining the Creative Arts Curriculum and Canon series. This series is presented with support from the National Forum for the Enhancement of Teaching and Learning in Higher Education and NUI Galway. So we're delighted to welcome four very excellent speakers to contribute to our discussion today, which will focus on reimagining the creative arts curriculum. Our first speaker is my colleague and webinar co-organizer, Professor Patrick Lonergan. Then we will have Dr. Ann Cleare, followed by Dr. Malcolm Sen and Dr. Keri Walsh. So Patrick is going to kick us off, and I'm just going to read a short bio to introduce Patrick to those of you who may not know him. He is Professor of Drama and Theatre Studies at the National University of Ireland, Galway, and a member of the Royal Irish Academy. He has edited or written 11 books on Irish drama and theatre, most recently including Irish Drama and Theatre since 1950, which was published by Bloomsbury in 2019. So Patrick, I'm going to hand it over to you to get us started.
Great, thanks a million, Ciara, and hi everyone. And it's great to see so many people here on a Friday afternoon to talk about this topic. Really looking forward to hearing the contributions. So look, I suppose my remarks are really introductory, and what I wanted to do is talk a little bit about the origins of this project, what we're hoping to learn, and really what our questions are as a way of getting us started. So this project originated when my colleague Aidan Thompson and we had the opportunity to apply for funding to the National Forum, as Ciara mentioned a moment ago, for a project that would enhance the teaching and learning that we're doing in the creative arts. Now, the creative arts at NUI Galway it's a relatively young area. Drama had its first undergraduate intake in 2012 as a degree subject. Music had its first undergraduate intake in 2018. So, naturally, I, together with my colleagues in drama and Aidan for music as well, we've been thinking a lot about what we teach, how we teach, what we can do that will show people that, our courses are, they can stand up to what else is out there in the world, but also be distinctive and also be innovative as well. So we've been thinking about a lot of these issues anyway. But as we discussed applying for support from the forum, the issue that we kept coming back to was the relationship between, broadly speaking, the canon and the curriculum. Now, we're going to trouble those terms a lot in the course of these webinars, but let's just put them up there for now in an uncomplicated way to say that we were worried about and thinking about the relationship between what is performed and what is taught, and how what is taught informs what's performed and vice versa. Obviously, for anyone working in theatre, in 2015, Waking the Feminists was an enormous wake-up call. It was very exciting, but it was also really an opportunity for us to kind of sit back and look at ourselves very carefully, really. Because I think we had to kind of face the fact that if it's true to say, as it was true to say, that theatre makers were not producing a gender-balanced programme in Ireland, well, then it was perfectly reasonable for us to ask, well, how were those people trained? What were they taught? What skills did they have? And to think about that in a constructive way about the future and to say, are the graduates that we have now equipped with those skills to think about the canon, to retrieve neglected plays, to do things that need to be done. So it was really an opportunity for us not to ignore the really important work that had already been done by scholars like Melissa Ciara and Kathy Leaney and countless others in Irish theatre, but really just to say we needed to do more. And that's really it. I mean, we know that as scholars, we have a role to play here, not just in teaching, but in relation to things like how we use our skills to retrieve scripts, how we edit things that have gone out of print, and just the advocacy we can do for figures who have been forgotten. Inevitably, I think it's also true to say that we're thinking about the links between research and teaching. So Ciara mentioned there a moment ago that I recently published a book about Irish theatre since 1950. So, again, this happens that when you go to a publisher and talk about publishing a book, publishers have to sell books. So they will always ask you, does this book meet existing need? And so you have to go and kind of produce evidence of like, here are the things that are being taught already. And so therefore this book will sell because there's a market for it. And the risk with that, of course, is that you're always therefore merely meeting the need that already exists. Now, of course, there's space in there to innovate, to say to a publisher, not only will we meet existing needs, we're also going to change the needs for the future. But the way the publishing is set up, often runs the risk of just reproducing the way things are done. So there's that balancing act between innovating and meeting the need that's there. So, I was writing this book in the wake of Waking the Feminists, and knowing that, the way of thinking about a book like this just had to change. And so as a test to myself, but also a test of the material, I just made the decision to ensure that the case studies in the book were evenly divided between male and female theatre makers. So, for example, it used to be the case that when we looked at the 1950s in Irish theatre, it's often described as the decade of Beckett and Behan. But why not have it be the decade of Beckett and Behan and Siobhan Mckenna? As a figure of global import and impact, Mckenna was at least as impactful as Beckett, and certainly more impactful in some ways than Behan. But hasn't been remembered as a playwright, certainly hasn't been remembered as an activist either. So putting her back into the narrative is an example of a kind of a shift. Shifting from a playwright-centered approach to Irish theatre to even a director-focused approach to Irish theatre also gives rise to new ways of thinking about what authorship is. If we look at the contributions that Gary Hines has made to Irish theatre, that is directing, but it's also authorship. She scripts, she shapes. The distinction between playwright and director, I think, breaks down with a figure like Gary. So what I suppose I found just through going through that process of writing that book is that there is a way of telling a story that's more inclusive. And no, it's not a definitive version. It's not that it's right. It's not that it's complete. Far from it. What it actually shows is that there are loads of ways to tell this story, and all of them can kind of stand up and have integrity as versions of the story. So we need to make space for those different versions. So that was the book. And then taking that, though, into teaching, I found was quite a bit more complicated, simply because of just practical things like the availability of texts. And, again, we have this vicious circle that for things to be published, they have to be taught, but we can't teach them unless they're published, and so on. So, there are some really good anthologies that address issues of diversity. There's no question of that. But the playwrights who I was really interested in teaching were people like Mary Manning and Una Troy and Maura Laverty. And these are really interesting writers. They could still be produced now. They deserve a place in the, on the stage and in our imaginations, but they're out of print. But because they're still in copyright, making a PDF of the script is not, it's not legal and not appropriate. So what do you do? So I had an interesting discussion with MA students last year about this, where the only way I could get them to read plays by Una Troy was to have them go to the library and read the prompt copies of Una Troy's plays in the Abbey Theatre Digital Archive. And what I found very powerful was that actually the frustration that the students experienced became part of the learning experience. And it kind of gave them a way into thinking about why it is that they can literally access Beckett and Friel and Murphy at the click of a button through online databases very readily, but that they had to go to so much trouble to access Una Troy. So they're able to kind of channel that frustration into something positive, but at the same time, that's not right. It shouldn't be like that, and it's not good enough. And so it's not a long-term solution. So, we're interested in looking at what we teach. We're interested in looking at how we teach. We're interested in who does the teaching as well. I think that's also an important part. We do want to build on what has already been achieved at NUI Galway. And there's been really important scholarship done in drama, in English, in history, Irish studies, languages, in the School of Irish as well. So, this has been thought about at length by colleagues in our university, but we want to do more. It's really as simple as that. We want it to be student-led insofar as possible. So our students will be going to the archives, finding things, putting them on, being led by their own interests, their own process of discovery. But we also want it to change us as well as teachers and as scholars too. Hopefully by the end of it, what we will be, I guess, committed to as teachers is the idea that, if you graduate as an artist from our university and other universities as well, perhaps, part of your toolkit is that ability to look at what's there, find the gaps, know where to look for the people who've been neglected, forgotten, and reimagine what we do. So the webinars will have a big part to this, and they're primarily about approaches to teaching. What we wanted to do, I think, Ciara and I, in talking about this particularly, we wanted to stage conversations where we can listen to other people who are dealing with similar things, whether in their teaching or their practice, or indeed both. These webinars are not about us telling anyone what to do. That's not the intention at all. They're about listening and giving us an opportunity to talk to each other and hear from each other as much as possible. We do know that there are many different approaches to the question of diversity, and we hope that these webinars will, over the course of the 12 weeks that we're going to do them, be properly representative and properly aware and sensitive to all of the responsibilities and obligations that we have. That's certainly our aim. That's certainly our objective as well. But I think what we're aiming for overall out of this project is the idea that when we have a problem or a challenge, we work with our students, all of us coming together across different academic disciplines to try and find solutions to this. And the students' discovery is part of the solution. Scholars' discovery is part of the solution as well. So I hope this will give us an opportunity to enhance our teaching, as I said, not just what we teach, but how we teach it. I hope it has an impact on practice, both now and in the future. The impact on practice could be with our creative arts partners right now in making scripts available, or in showing how old plays still stand up to new approaches. There are lots of ways this could happen. But I hope it also affects the future of practice in producing graduates who will see these practices of rediscovery and reimagination as part of their toolkit, and who will know that this thing that we call the canon is a work in progress, and it can be changed at any stage, and that's something that we can and should do. So look, loads more to say, but I hope that that's an introduction to what we're trying to achieve here anyway.
Thanks very much for that, Patrick. Really comprehensive overview of the aims of the webinars. So thanks very much. And I'm sure that we'll have loads of questions and further conversations on that. But now I want to move on to our second speaker, who is Dr. Ann Cleare. So Dr. Ann Cleare is an Irish composer working in the areas of concert music, opera, extended sonic environments, and hybrid instrumental design. She is Assistant Professor of Music and Media Technologies at Trinity College Dublin, and she is a recipient of the 2019 Ernst von Siemens Composer Prize. Her work has been commissioned and presented by broadcasters nationally and internationally, so many that I couldn't possibly name them all here. So I'll hand it over to Ann
now. Thanks a lot, Ciara. Hello, everyone. Very nice to be here today with you all, and many thanks to Ciara, Patrick, and all at NUIG for organising the event. As an artist and an educator, there are many fascinating words for me to interpret and to unpack in the title of today's webinar. As someone working in the creative arts, I generally introduce myself as a composer and as someone who teaches composition. But to be totally honest, the word composition isn't one that rests easy with me. And this isn't so much because of the word composer itself, but more about what it suggests to people. It suggests that I write music. That's a fair enough assumption, I think. And music is the word that I particularly struggle with. To try to express why this is and why it relates to today's topic as succinctly as I possibly can, I can say that I do not seem to have ever differentiated between music and sound as very different things, either on a frequential or a temporal level, in the way that most people do. To me, every and all sound is a component on a ginormous scale of sound, which one could compose from, and none is more valuable or worthy than the next one, until one chooses to make it so. And this thinking is representative of the work I make, work that explores places and ideas, both real and imagined, through sound, to present alternative orders of sonic being, and to do this in a way that dimensionalizes sonic material and the space it inhabits. As a child, I learned to play both Western classical music and Irish traditional music, And even though I enjoyed both very much, I remember thinking they were both very limited systems of information and expression, like a very simple surface of a much more hidden, complex, and multidimensional system. I would sit at the piano and play D4 and then D sharp 4, and would think to myself that there is such a distance between these semitones, such a wealth of information missing, and the mechanisms of the instruments I was playing, which were piano and woodwinds, would not allow me to bridge the distance between such semitones. Playing the common intervals of a piece in an A flat major Chopin waltz or a jig in E minor felt to me like taking giant one-dimensional steps and leaps, and I wanted to traverse and explore the sound in between these sounds. I would listen to the sounds of the world around me, particularly to the sounds of farming and industrial machinery, and hear them mostly hovering around one main tone, and that there were so many gradations to this tone. Even though I didn't know of the terms at the time, they were microtonally and timbrally complex, two parameters that now intrigue me, in a way that the tonal music I was playing was completely lacking. And furthermore, these environmental sounds possess their own temporal and rhythmic character, and one that was not bound by periodic pulse. I remember the great trepidation I felt when my piano teacher finally agreed to teach me Johann Strauss's Blue Danube, which I'm sure many of you know. At this young age, even though I knew the piece well from hearing it, I didn't know that the word Danube was what the word Danube was referring to until my teacher informed me that it was a river, an important European river. My excitement for learning the piece was then replaced by utter confusion and disbelief. What type of river moves in 3/4 waltz time, resonates in C major, and has such periodic waves? Certainly nothing I experienced in the Midlands of Ireland during my youth. I think it was from this moment in particular that I knew that sound was going to be a very important part of my life, and that music, as I knew it then, would have to expand its boundaries drastically if I were to ever find a place for myself within it. As the American artist Ash Fury puts it, Western music history is filled with language's attempt to colonize sound, to stuff acoustic energy into rigid shapes and orderly syntaxes that can be mapped, charted, permutated, and justified with logic. Unlike many art forms within the creative arts, it is my experience that the vast majority of music departments and conservatories take this charitable approach to thinking about music and mainly focus on repertoire from the distant to far distant past. After years of studying and teaching in various music departments, I now teach on a course called Music and Media Technologies, and this is based in a department of electrical and electronic engineering. And I can't tell you how different an environment this is. It's the first time in my life where I'm not surrounded by music's past, but rather its future. In an engineering department, there is very little attention or rivalry between the Baroque engineers, the classical engineers, the romantic engineers, the jazz engineers, or the ethnomusicology engineers. Instead, there is a focus on innovation, on design, on materials, on energy, on sustainability, and on the future. And somehow all of these modes of thinking relate very closely to how I think about my sonic work and teaching. I tend to use the word sonic rather than musical, because sonic relates more suitably to the huge scale of sound that I explore and devise for each and every work. And so my role is devising my own scale for a piece and composing from it. And this process often feels both scientific and sculptural in nature, measuring a sound's frequency and volume and finding new harmonic and inharmonic relationships between different points on the sonic scale. It is composerly in the same way someone composing within a tonal system works, with consonance and dissonance, but it includes and allows for a far wider spectrum of material and processes. I am a materialist, not so much in the Marxist sense of the word, but more in the Jane Bennett sense of it. Or as Diana Kuhl and Samantha Frost suggest in their book, New Materialisms, they say, and this is a quote, as human beings, we inhabit an inevitably material world. We live our everyday lives surrounded by, immersed in matter. We are ourselves composed of matter. We experience its restlessness, its intransigence, even as we reconfigure and consume it. At every turn, we encounter physical objects fashioned by human design and endure natural forces whose imperative structures are daily routines for survival. Our existence depends from one moment to the next on myriad microorganisms and diverse higher species, on our own hazily understood bodily and cellular reactions, and on pitiless cosmic motions, on the material artifacts and natural stuff that populate our environment, as well as on socioeconomic structures that produce and reproduce the conditions of our everyday lives. In light of this massive materiality, how could we be anything other than materialist? How could we ignore the power of matter and the ways it materializes in our ordinary experiences, or fail to acknowledge the primacy of matter in our own theories? This is where my teaching and curriculum building begins from a point where music and all of its parameters are brought into question. And every student is asked to discover or rediscover these ideas for themselves. So as an example, I'd like to look at a sample exercise that I use for one of my creative classes. So just bear with me while I share this. Okay, so this would be a sample portfolio exercise that I would give to many students taking composition. And so it's specifically targeting the idea of line in music. And so this is what I asked them to do. Compose a short piece for solo clarinet that specifically expands your approach to the composition of line. This should be approximately 20 seconds in duration and take the form of one long phrase or a few shorter phrases. In preparation for this, consider how the non-musical as well as the musical might inspire your thinking. Rather than thinking in typically musical or tonal terms, consider how the sounds, sights, ideas of your life, everyday life, might inspire your idea of a line or phrase and its timbre and shaping. To encourage this way of thinking, I would like you to make a field recording of an everyday sound that you find compelling and that offers you rich sonic possibilities to compose with. Once you have recorded this with whatever technology you have available, analyze the contour and pitch qualities of the line from your field recordings and consider if they could inform the creation of line for this exercise. Alternatively, or additionally, you might like to take photographs of lines that you can observe in and around your environment and think visually about this exercise as well as orally. And then I give a few more details on requirements, but then maybe something else to note about shape. So I say, think about the music that we have looked at in class today, where line is represented in a multitude of ways, sculpted into unusual contours and shapes with careful consideration. Can you approach the composition of line in a similar way, perhaps using the sonic qualities of the field recording as possible inspiration for contour, gesture, pitch, texture, shaping of sound and motion? So this exercise asks the student to engage with what line in music means to them, why that is, and how could exploring ideas of line outside of the music they already know help them to expand their thinking within this parameter. to allow for a wider sense of the world to find its way into the students' compositional language and thinking. In my experience of working with students on this exercise, they go through many stages of confusion and elation and then confusion again. But that's what I think is the really important part of the task. It should confuse you. It should make you think harder than you've ever had to think. And when you finally arrive at a point where you think you know what line is and what it could be in your music, your critical thinking, technical abilities, and awareness of how your mind works will have expanded enormously, regardless of what type of music you want to write. For me, the most compelling works of art are the ones you encounter, and like it or not, you realize you have stepped into an alternative way of seeing the world, that the artist who created the piece has thought deeply about their aims, their materials, and their language. But to make works like this, the artist needs to be critically attuned to their own mind and methods. They need to constantly question what is important and what's not important in their work, what's allowed in their work and what's not allowed in their work, and why is that? In other words, they need to become their own teacher, a teacher that is constantly asking them to assess, to reassess, to imagine, to reimagine, and to never take anything as a given or as, well, that's just the way music is. To encourage and nourish the making of such artworks, we need curriculums and curriculum activities that teach students to be their own critically minded, adventurous teachers and explorers, and to teach and explore in a way that includes the world around them. That's it from me. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Anne, for that really compelling and interesting presentation. It's great to have the example of the exercise there to work from. I think a teachable moment for us all. So thank you so much. I'm going to move on now to our third speaker, Dr. Malcolm Sen, who is Assistant Professor in the Department of English at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. His research interests focus on questions of justice, statecraft, and post-colonial politics as they emerge in this contemporary moment of climate crisis. He is published widely on Irish literature, and we're very happy to have him here today. So Malcolm, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Ciara, and thanks, Patrick, for inviting me to this, and thanks to everybody for being here. I'll talk briefly, maybe for 10 minutes, about my research, also my teaching, and also maybe what we are trying to do institutionally and in my department here at UMass. So let me share a screen here very quickly with you all. I hope you can all see that presentation. Okay, so I obviously work within the area of climate change and environmental humanities, as we like to call it. And the rationale for that is really not because the story of climate change needs to be told. It has been told numerous times. But really because no greater story needs retelling at this contemporary moment over and over than the story about anthropogenic climate change. And in many ways, we have already begun such retellings, not least by refashioning, renaming climate change. And we call it now climate crisis or climate breakdown, climate chaos or climate apocalypse. And it is as if our nomenclature obsessively pointing out its own failure to fully do justice to the enormity of the crisis, really. And climate change is, of course, a problem. For some, it is a problem that needs fixing to escape its worst effects. For others, it is a problem from which escape is already impossible. However, for almost everybody, it seems to me, it remains a problem for which words prove inadequate, outdated, and uninspired. And sometimes this outdated nature of our vocabulary can also be quite violent. But of course, the climate crisis is not the only crisis we are facing. we really have been living for the last 40 years in an age of chronic crisis, right? We've seen the oil crisis, we've seen the financial crisis, we've seen examples of sovereign debt crisis and the housing crisis, a food crisis, a migrant and refugee crisis, a crisis of nationalisms, and the forever wars that continue on literally forever. We are currently in the crisis of pandemics. But the way to kind of think about the climate crisis is to actually see it as a complex of all these crises together. And I think climate change as a complex of crisis gives really rise to some very interesting questions in terms of pedagogy, in terms of research. So just as the stratigraphic layers of the planet have been etched by the telluric, geological force of humans during the Anthropocene epoch, I would say climate change also marks a radically new stratum to the palimpsest of techniques and methods we have used to teach and to learn and to research. In essence, this period of chaos and crisis, I would say, detonates established pedagogical practices, especially in the arts. And I think there are a number of reasons for this, not least the fact that climate change has been fetishized really as a scientific, political, and economic problem with scientific, political, and economic solutions. I think the culture surrounding the climate crisis fetishizes STEM disciplines. And there are inherent dangers associated with this fetishization. Not least of this is the fact of geoengineering as a technological solution to the complex of crises that a changing climate heralds. So technological utopianism goes hand in hand with neoliberalism's desire to shape our future as debt-ridden, and greenwashing really the very concept of sustainability. So taken together, I would say such fetishization and utopianism has the potential to make the humanities and the arts appear out of sync with lived realities and predictable or predicted futures. And we can see this kind of bifurcation because the arts have been really relegated to the kind of soft advocacy work of reasserting the work of the sciences, really, especially when it comes to the discourse of climate change. So in terms of, public culture, questions of climate and weather, questions of oil or petromodernity, questions of economy and sustainability are really relegated to the sciences. Whereas the arts really are given some of the kind of the soft advocacy work, right, of gender representation, of race representation, questions of memory and trauma and history, etc. But of course, this is not the whole story of the humanities and the arts. Naomi Klein's book is a very interesting book in this regard. Like the scholarship of many others, I think she has tried to show the essentially human issues, structures of power and economic paradigms that all underwrite the climate crisis. Climate really isn't an issue, she says, to add to the list of things to worry about next to healthcare and taxes. It is a civilizational wake-up call. So it in many ways behooves really the arts and the humanities to rethink the climate crisis. And one way to do this would be to kind of follow some methods we learn in post-colonial methodologies. So if you were to kind of think about climate change in the discourse of public policy, it comes up as a threat multiplier for national security. And of course, this is, really in many ways, actually, is a skewing of the actuality of the climate crisis, right? There are more migration kind of within nations than I would say there is migration across nations to all the way going to North America, for example. So climate change is essentially a human story, and the humanities have always been the disciplines really that have been talking about this kind of human story. And we kind of in many ways need to realize that, I would say. So part of my research in many ways has been to kind of recognize that there is a lacune in thinking about literature in relation to this question of climate. So one of the books I'm editing at the moment is really looking at the history of Irish literature from an entirely new perspective. This is a perspective of the environment, not necessarily in relation to the descriptions of nature in Irish literature, but really kind of looking at it from the question, from the perspective of climate and climate change. And we have numerous examples of ruminations, for example, on the question of climate. The Gaelic Annals gives us some great examples, as Francis Ludlow and Conor Costick will show us in this chapter of theirs. Now, the climate crisis is, of course, not simply an environmental crisis. There are ramifications even for some other urgent issues that crop up in Irish studies, one of which is the representation of race in Irish literature, and indeed speaking about the politics of race in Irish studies. So there is another book that Julie McCormack-Weng and I are editing, and this really provides I would say, attempts to provide a very comprehensive analysis of how questions of race, culture, capital are in many ways also demonstrated in questions of economy, in questions of climate. At an institutional level, we have in a way tried to address this need that we recognize among students who kind of want to think more deeply about questions of climate, about questions of justice. And in the Department of English here at UMass, we have introduced these specializations, right? Not only in area studies like American studies, not only in subdisciplines like creative writing or the digital humanities, but actually also ones that deal with the question of literature as history, or the environmental humanities, which thinks about questions related to nature, environment, ecology, and questions of climate and weather. So, in the English department here at UMass, if an undergraduate student wants to get a specialization in the environmental humanities, there are 3 required courses capped off really by a special topics seminar at the 400 level, which is really in their kind of final year, often taught as an honors level course, which requires them to write a very extensive thesis on the subject. And as you will see, the way I teach the literature of Ireland is actually kind of within this framework of ecology and climate. One of the things I've introduced at UMass really is to kind of rethink Irish studies from an ecological perspective. So we think about questions of capital, culture, climate. We think about rewriting the Irish canon, not necessarily by inserting writers who have been relegated to the shadows. Of course, we try and kind of do that, but also how the canon itself might indeed be relevant to us in relation to these kind of futuristic questions that dominate our present. Right. And one of the things I suppose I would have recognized here in America is that the rhetoric surrounding race is quite, I would say, a little bit more nuanced than the rhetoric surrounding race in Ireland in the 2000s. That obviously is radically changing now. At a more kind of global, wider perspective, we can actually kind of also recognize the fact that there are movements in theatre. For example, the Climate Change Theatre Action is a good example, which puts out small plays during the annual COP talks that the UN organizes. The very art world is also radically being reshaped by the climate crisis, and not just art, but indeed also kind of music. And I think these are kind of avenues that I'd like to pursue in future years teaching here. And I think I'm going to end there because I'm very close to my 10 minutes. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Malcolm, for that really insightful presentation. It's interesting to kind of see how we kind of like draw those kind of parallels between issues of kind of ecology and canonicity, and looking forward to exploring that more in the discussion. But now we have our final panelist of the presentation, and that's Dr. Keri Walsh, who is the Director of the Institute of Irish Studies at Fordham University and founder of Fordham's annual Irish Women Writers Symposium. She has written extensively on modern Irish literature and also writes about film. In 2018, she was awarded the Academy of Motion Pictures Arts and Sciences Academy Skill Film Scholar Fellowship to support work on her book in progress, Stella's Claim, Women, Method Acting and the Hollywood Film. And she is now also working on a book about the Paris bookstore Shakespeare and Company. So I'll pass it over to Keri now for our final presentation.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be engaging in what feels like a conference in Ireland, even though I'm in New York. So I am an associate professor of English and the director of the Institute of Irish Studies at Fordham University in New York. And what I want to talk to you a little bit about today are two courses that I have been working on for the past few years, in which I have been trying to create a kind of equity and sort of equality in representation in these two courses. One of them is a course called Modern Irish Literature, a fairly what began as a fairly traditional survey of modern Irish literature that I have been working to improve over the last 5 years. And the other one is a film history survey. And just sort of to give you a sense of the kind of big picture, I want to sort of talk about how in some ways, how successful the remake of the modern Irish literature syllabus has been versus some of the greater challenges that I've experienced while trying to remake the film history syllabus. I found more challenging, and that was partly for personal reasons, perhaps, that my institutional training is in literature, but also I think for reasons having to do with the field itself. So let me first talk about the remake of my modern Irish literature syllabus. This course, which began as a kind of Jonathan Swift, like wild Bram Stoker, Seamus Heaney, O'Casey, that kind of syllabus. It was around the time of the Waking the Feminist movement in theater that I sort of got inspired to start breaking the syllabus apart and trying to see how I could think about it differently. And something that I decided to do, which has proven sort of successful beyond my imaginings at the beginning, was to begin a yearly symposium at Fordham called the Irish Women Writers Symposium, because I noticed that at a lot of other institutions were specializing in different things and had different kinds of priorities in their Irish programming. So I thought, what if we become a home in terms of our programming for works by women writers? And so every year in the autumn, I would plan a symposium inviting some keynote speakers and using my own class as an audience. And it began with novelists, we had playwrights, we had comedians, we had a very loose kind of understanding of what a writer is. We've had filmmakers, and it's included people like Emily Pine, Sinead Gleason, and Enright, who have come and spoken to us. But I've also had a kind of looser understanding of the temporality, where some years we won't have necessarily a creative writer, but we'll have a topic. So we had a seminar on Edgeworth 2 years ago, and we brought scholars over from Trinity College. And, so we kind of have anything, every year we have a conference, and it is somehow focused either on practitioners or on generating scholarship about writers about whom there should be more scholarship, etc. And at first, when I started this symposium, I thought, okay, the reason I'm going to do this is because we have these amazingly powerful, magnificent writers like Joyce and Yeats, and I need the women writers on the syllabus to be able to somehow compete with them, right? That was my first thought, that like, it has to be exciting when I bring in women writers. I don't want it to feel like, okay, and now we're doing the mandatory like woman component. I did not want that. So what I did was I thought liveness could make up that difference, you know, by having authors there in the flesh reading to them, that would give the sort of excitement to those texts. So that absolutely happened. And I would say in some strange way, we were almost a victim. I was almost a victim of my own success, because the texts that I thought, the more contemporary texts that were going to be, in some sense, I don't know why I thought they would be a harder sell in some case, they actually started taking over the syllabus, so that now my syllabus is definitely more than half women writers. And everything that I've added every year to accommodate the symposium has stayed on my syllabus. So short stories by Anne Enright, or essays by Sinead Gleason. You know, this year I taught Sally Rooney's Normal People. So each thing that gets added kind of stays. And then that leaves me with, it almost left me with two challenges, which is, you know, what was now the role, like how much space was there going to be for everything? And I think, of course, that's a common question when you are trying to change a syllabus, is like, how do you fit everything in? You've already had a lot of material to cover, and now that you're including more voices and more people, you've got more material to cover. So one of the things that one way that I decided to think about this was in terms of thinking about time in a different way. So you might think that you need like a whole hour to cover something, or that, you know, if you can't spend 4 weeks on Joyce, you haven't done Joyce. And I had to learn to think in a different way. So for instance, sometimes just having 10 minutes at the beginning of class to talk about something is covering it. You know, just pointing people to all that's there. Of course, there are things that you want to spend a lot of time on and go deeply into depth with, but I think the message I want to communicate is that there is room. There's room for everything and everyone. So, you know, you just have to think creatively about how you're going to position. Sometimes it's the strategy of the paired text, where you have text in dialogue with each other. Other times you might just lecture on one thing and then include another thing in more depth. But, you know, I found that I was no longer particularly concerned about the question of everything fitting. And I also took a sort of longer historical perspective. You know, some years the course have Shaw on it, and other years it might not, and that's okay. So that all went very well. And so then after the sort of getting my syllabus to the point where it was largely women writers, I started then thinking about how I was going to incorporate writers of color into my Irish literature syllabus. And to date, I have the most successful way in which I've done that is through the inclusion of American literature in the Irish course. So I'm still working on ways to have Irish literature in the course, but two texts that have been really useful for me in teaching is, one is Kirsten Greenage's play The Luck of the Irish, which is a play set in Boston about an Irish American family and an African American family kind of negotiating injustices in housing. And so to have that American play at the midpoint of my syllabus, it's a kind of wake-up call for my students, because I think up until that point of the semester, they're in a kind of narrative, a romantic narrative about Ireland and the oppression of the Irish, and, you know, the penal laws and decolonization. And then at that midpoint of the semester, they are asked to think about Irish American whiteness and racism, and it just sort of changes the whole dynamic of the course. So I would really recommend Kirsten Greenage's play The Luck of the Irish on a modern Irish literature course syllabus. And then another thing I'm working on is a unit that will be about Daniel O'Connell's relationship with the abolitionist Frederick Douglass, to kind of create a transatlantic conversation there. So, you know, in general, I feel like the modern Irish literature course has been just going in the direction that I want it to go in for the last few years, and that the students have responded extremely well. The one regard in which I felt I was almost a victim of my own success was in the extent to which I brought Maud Gunn's work onto the syllabus, her Irish nationalist writings, and, you know, taught a few of her essays. And if you teach Maud Gonne first and then you teach Yeats, students are going to hate Yeats. They just have no time for it anymore. So they're like, they see Maud Gonne as this incredibly dynamic, brilliant orator and committed activist. And then they go look at Yeats kind of shoehorning her into this role, and they just hate him. So at a certain point, I started to feel bad because I thought, this is not really serving Yeats. I mean, there's a lot to Yeats other than that. So I'm still working on how, it's not that I want to be an apologist for like a male writer who had sexism, but I also want to, I want people to understand what Yeats is doing, what the lyric is, and what his contribution and importance is. So in a sense, I need to like recalibrate that. So that was the modern Irish literature syllabus. And maybe I'll just talk for a few minutes about the film history syllabus and some of the reasons why it has been slightly more challenging for me to feel that I'm moving in the right direction with the syllabus. So it began as, again, like the Irish syllabus, like a fairly conventional film history syllabus. And some of the things that I think made it more difficult to decolonize, if you will, are, first of all, just the dynamics of pop culture. So much of the history of film kind of has this gravitational pull toward Hollywood film. And when you get to Hollywood film, you're dealing with, capital and reification and objectification and all these things that are just a little bit harder to sort of place into a humanistic narrative of human emancipation, because you're dealing with things like genre and film noir and violence and sexualization. So just the dynamics of pop culture make it a little more tricky. Second, all the sort of bars to access of, for instance, women artists and artists of color into filmmaking because of the problems of capital and how you need a whole team. And then, of course, the very sort of lowering presence of the director as a figure in film studies, which is, of course, most famously associated with the Auteur Theory. And, the Auteur Theory, which kind of makes the director the locus of all meaning in a film, is very much the enemy of a sort of feminist understanding of film, because what you technically have is a usually white male figure who is being credited with the work of a whole bunch of other people, everyone else who worked on the film, the costume designers, the writers, the actors, even the business people, the producers. So that's a very kind of damaging way of understanding authorship in film. So in terms of trying to remake my film history syllabus, I'll just mention three ways that I've started to do so that have been somewhat helpful. So one is to challenge the Auteur Theory head on and to just say, like, the director is not the author of a film. The author, authorship needs to be thought of in much more complex ways. And so, for instance, that's led to really interesting conversations about editing and how often women have served as film editors. And since editing is, in some sense, what film language is, that, there's a very good case to be made that editors are the authors of films. And so finding in the Soviet tradition or in Hollywood or, in any place in film history where women have been prominent as editors has been a kind of interesting way of displacing the figure of the auteur. And then a second way in which I've been trying to just kind of break up what feels like the hegemony of film studies sometimes is with an emphasis on filmmaking. And there's a text that I just wanted to recommend that's just incredibly empowering by the filmmaker Maya Deren, the American experimental filmmaker. And it's a 1946 essay called Magic is New. And there she dismisses all the reasons why people think that they can't be filmmakers. She goes through a list of, you think you can't make a film because you don't have money, you don't have technical skill, you don't have time. And she ends by saying, the actual operation of a motion picture camera is very simple and consists largely of pressing a button. All the rest is achieved best if it is developed as one goes along in answer to some requirement of the imagination. So this is the moment at the midpoint of my film history syllabus now, where I introduce Darren's essay and also some of her films, and challenge my students to become filmmakers. That seems to be the best way of sort of displacing the kind of awe factor of Hollywood special effects and money and everything, and just saying, no, the essence of this is that anyone can make a film and edit the film and make a work of art. And so now filmmaking has become a part of my film course. And I feel like it just shifts students into a very different mentality in terms of understanding film. And I guess I just want to conclude by recommending two other works that I have started teaching that have opened up some space in film history. One is Cheryl Dunye's film, The Watermelon Woman, which is a mid-90s work of new queer cinema in which Dunye is herself in the film, a filmmaker trying to research the history of 1940s Hollywood, and particularly to find the history of an actress sort of based on Hattie McDaniel. And she goes through this whole documentary project kind of with a straight face, and it's only revealed at the end that the figure she's looking for was fictional and never existed. And so this film, The Watermelon Woman, opens up really complex and interesting questions about what we are doing in our work of restoration, what we're looking for when we're trying to rediscover women artists and sort of place them back into the tradition, and how tantalizing that is, but also what escapes that process. And then the final film I wanted to recommend that has been sort of powerful in helping me remake my film history syllabus is Bill Morrison's Dawson City Frozen Time, which actually brings us into some of the terrain of Malcolm Sen's presentation, because Dawson City Frozen Time is about the distribution line of early silent film and how films were taken across North America until they ended up in Dawson City, the last place on the line of distribution. They were screened in Dawson City and then they were discarded. And so what ended up happening was that all of these silent films were buried underground at some point because there was nowhere else to put them, and they were rediscovered a few years later, like in the 70s. And so now it's one of the most important repositories of preserved silent film. And Bill Morrison in the documentary develops this narrative, the discovery of these nitrate films, into something much more complex than just a like, hey, we found them, yay, we've filled in some blanks of film history, into a much, what you might even call an indictment of the film industry for its kind of environmental devastation and the way that it proceeded in, alongside colonization, settler colonization. So it's an incredibly mind-blowing film, actually. And so, in both courses, I have been trying to both do the work of diversifying the syllabi, but also think about that work and what we're trying to, the gaps we're trying to fill in and what happens in the process of that work. And then, of course, as a researcher, I just wanted to end by saying that I have been engaged in the kind of work that Patrick cares about in terms of, finding scripts. And I would love to talk more about that in the discussion, because I just want to end with this one idea that, one of the problems of losing plays by women is that we don't have them, and that once we get them back, now we have them, if we transcribe them and publish them, that's great. But one of the things that makes me sad is that those works are missing a history. They're missing what you have around the works of Shaw or O'Casey, which is like all of the accumulated history that you get when a play is in perpetual production and perpetual knowledge for certain decades. You can think, okay, Catherine Cornell played this role, and then so-and-so played this role. And all of that theater history is kind of missing when you've been missing a play, like a Teresa Deevy play or a Kate O'Brien play. And so you have kind of this more time capsule thing where you pull this play, out of the ground, and then suddenly you have it. But what do you do with it? What's its relationship to everything else? So I'll just end there and say I love working through these questions, and I've found something extremely valuable in each of the talks that I've just heard. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Keri, and to all our speakers. It struck me there, when you were talking about the idea of authorship and practice, there's a lot of connections to be made between kind of film and theatre in that regard, and the labour and the work that goes on behind the scenes, that gets hidden, and kind of like, captured in the kind of writer or author kind of paradigm. So thank you very much. So I want to just say a big thanks to all four speakers for really engaging presentations. And I think that there's a lot of food for thought there, and I'm sure that we're going to have an engaging discussion. So feel free to post your questions or your comments in the chat. I'm going to just start it off while you're kind of like composing those thoughts by talking a little bit about something that came up, I think, across all four presentations, was the idea of kind of like the recasting of boundaries and, lenses and frames and how we're challenging those. Patrick, and Keri both referenced the idea of like waking the feminists as this kind of like wake up call moment. Malcolm as well on the idea of the violence of vocabulary and how like, these crises that we're living through at the moment kind of like detonates the kind of pedagogical practices that we approach. And Anne as well on this idea of, where is the boundary between, like teaching and learning in terms of how we empower students to become their own teachers, which I know is something that resonated with a lot of people. But I wanted to just ask a question, I suppose, about gatekeeping, I think, because, sitting in an academic context here, like we are to a certain extent the gatekeepers of the canon and of the curriculum. And it's why, this webinar series, I think, is going to be really important. What is our role, I suppose, like fundamentally, like as educators to kind of like open the gates and kind of keep them open, I suppose. I'll open that up to anyone who wants to take it on, because I know we're getting some other chats in as well. Patrick, yeah.
I might just kick us off. So yeah, thanks everyone, really loads of great things there. I think to some extent the business of being led by our students actually is often the way forward here, as a way of kind of keeping us open to new possibilities. So earlier today I was teaching a course similar to the one that Keri described, modern Irish literature, and it's mostly looking at fiction, so it has people like Sally Rooney on it. This Hostile Life, which Romy mentioned in the chat there, that's in it too. But one of the things I tried out today to see how it would work is to compare a poem by Paul Muldoon, which is called On Sha, with a song by the Zambian Irish hip hop artist Denise Chila, which is also called On Sha. And to look at the way in which Muldoon uses the word On Sha, it's on the one hand a kind of an assertion of, it's me, here I am. But on the other hand, it's very regimental because it's the way that the teacher keeps everyone in line in a classroom. So it's got that mix of kind of surveillance and assertiveness in it. And then you look at Denise Chila doing her song like 2 years ago, released, young hip hop artist, using the word in the same way, using it to think about her own identity in the world, her own identity in Ireland as well. And so there's evidence of a tradition there. There's evidence of a pattern that's there as well. But there's also evidence that, we're breaking the boundaries in terms of like looking at songwriting as a form of writing, looking at hip hop as a form of culture that deserves attention, and in lots of other ways as well. So, I think it's a slightly banal thing to say, but I think we have to constantly be open to what our students are listening to, what they're reading themselves, what are the experiences they're bringing into the classroom themselves. And if we can do that, then I think that helps us a lot.
Yeah. I don't know if anybody else wants to come in on that.
This is just actually sort of the same kind of point that Patrick just made, but yes, I agree. My students at Fordham University are obsessed with rap, and a lot of my Gabelli business students are particularly, for them, it is a gateway into poetry, art, and like identity, and they just love it so much. And so I've opened up my syllabus to allow students to write on whatever they want to write on. So if the course is called Modern Irish Literature and they want to do a study of rap, that's fine. And one of the films I actually brought onto my Modern Irish Lit syllabus this year was Rada Blank's The 40-Year-Old Version, an absolutely magnificent film, a feminist hip hop film from this year set in Brooklyn. But it just went with the Dead so beautifully. When I was teaching Joyce's The Dead and everything to do with like the oral tradition and the idea of culture and what makes you authentic or a sellout. This film was just a perfect complement, and my students wrote beautiful essays comparing the dead and the 40-year-old version.
I would love to be in that class.
Can I jump in there as well, actually, just to kind of reassert what Keri is saying? Joyce works remarkably well with hip hop and rap. I've actually supervised a couple of theses. If you wouldn't mind, I'll just share the screen. For example, there are websites devoted to querying whether James Joyce said it or the surrealist rapper Kool Keith said it, right? So I do think that is a kind of a, an area of potential, scholarship ahead for all of us, maybe.
Yeah. And Anne, I think with you as well, when you were kind of talking about the idea of, like what we call music, or, this idea of kind of like the idea of the sonic, and the kind of position that in that kind of like, that, and the idea of, the engineers aren't fighting with each other over kind of like turf in terms of like their own backgrounds, and the exercise that you shared with us, there's kind of a permission given then to the students, isn't there, to kind of like allow themselves to kind of more openly kind of like explore and kind of break those boundaries. Whereas, as you said, there's a kind of rigidity oftentimes in kind of like music pedagogy that can kind of make that feel intimidating, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's why, I showed maybe that exercise, and there's other ones related to harmony and rhythm and texture and so on. Because really it allows a student, well, at least it should allow a student to write whatever they want to write. So I'm not saying to them, you have to write tonal music, you have to write something that's like hip hop, you have to write something that's like jazz or that's like early music, because all of those musics deal with line. So it's actually just asking them to think about it in a kind of unbiased way, or the least unbiased way they can, and see what happens. Because sadly, a lot of music pedagogy is very much stylistic, kind of pastiche type teaching, like this is how you create this effect. And so it becomes a lesson in pastiche rather than trying to maybe hone someone's own kind of original voice and make them critical of those parameters. And, I think too, maybe something that I'm always quite jealous of in terms of listening to people who are working in literature and film, like today, is just it seems the emphasis there is on relevantly new work, and how rare that can be in music departments too. I mean, the music departments are just really stuck in the past in terms of repertoire and exploration of it. It does seem like we're very far behind, even listening to what people have been talking about in their curriculums today.
Thanks, Anne. And there's great discussion going on in the chat about the idea of authorship across media. And I think, Keri, what you were kind of saying about the film Auteur is resonating there. People are kind of querying the idea of, how does that happen in theatre? You know what I mean? And, many people are arguing that it does. We had the kind of like, writer and director kind of model for so long. And so I'm wondering, in terms of film and theatre, like the impact of that kind of single authorship system, the impact that has on pedagogy. So I'll again throw that out wide open. Keri, I'll come to you first if you want.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that you can do to try to start breaking up that auteur model is to historicize it, to introduce the works of the 1950s cahiers de cinema critics who are promoting the auteur theory, and then show how it then later attaches to filmmakers like Scorsese and others, and then do that kind of work where you talk about Scorsese's film editor and try to sit down with who's a woman, try to sit down with the class and look at how the editing is contributing. Then you can start teaching them out of the auteur model, because everyone's, I think, already in the auteur model when they get there, right? So you have to almost historicize it and then start deconstructing it in class. But I think that it dies hard too, because it's just hard to remember it's hard to remember that when, I think it's because of our ideas of authorship, about, it sort of goes back to like romantic ideas of authorship and works of art having to come from some kind of solitary genius, and film just does not work like that at all, even more so than literature. I don't think literature really works like that either, but film really doesn't. And so I don't know, it has to keep being taught and retaught in my experience.
Yeah. And Patrick, I might come to you next because, film certainly doesn't work that way. Theatre definitely doesn't. Like, it takes a village to like mount a production. But, so often in the Irish context, especially, it's been writers even more so than even like the advent of the director. Like, how would you kind of view that, like in Irish theatre in particular?
Yeah, I mean, somebody has just put in the chat there, Melissa, in fact, the theatre maker is now an inclusive way to transcend the hierarchies. And I think that's really a very good point. And we definitely need to move away from those hierarchical ways of doing things. But I was also very interested in what Anne was saying about music departments. So for the last 2 years, I've been kind of an interloper in our own music department in Galway in teaching musical theatre. And, the auteur thing, it does exist in musical theatre and the history of musical theatre. There's plenty of evidence of the casting couch phenomenon of abuse of power and so on. So I'm not, hiding away from any of that. But to talk about musical theatre, you just instantly have to talk about collaboration. It's not just a composer, it's a lyricist, it's a director, it's the actors, it's the audience. And it's been really interesting for me to have a lot of my own assumptions about what students know challenged by working with music students who perhaps might be used to that romantic idea of the composer who knows it all. So yeah, I think we have a lot to actually learn from teaching into and out of each other's curriculums as well. Yeah.
And there's a question here for Malcolm and Keri from Tony Tracy from our film department at NUI Galway, wondering whether either of you ever taught or tried to include Irish film across your own module. So Malcolm, I might come to you first, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. So I think it has changed over the years, really, and the kind of films I've taught, for example, have also changed. I do reference multiple films that students are, that they watch themselves and they might want to write about, for sure. I have concentrated, I have to say, given the fact that I'm not actually a film critic, right, or a scholar of film. I have treated them very much as cultural artifacts, right? And I think documentaries have worked quite well in that regard for my classes, especially during Zoom classes. They've come in very, very handy. I'm also, of course, dealing with a set of Irish American students often, or indeed the welcome change, given the fact that I am actually Indian teaching Irish literature, has also changed the demographic of my classes over the last 5 years. So now I have students who are Black, but actually sometimes have Irish surnames, right, who are now sitting in my classes. And that transformation has very much been because I am the one teaching, I would say. I've seen that kind of transition over the last 5 years. So given that demographic, I'm very conscious of the stereotypes that I actually also have to address and break down. And I think documentary films have been quite an interesting way of kind of doing that, So the idea of Ireland within certain sections of Irish America, could be challenged, or their historical understanding could be deepened. So documentaries really have been the way. I have to say, though, a lot of my students have ended up doing kind of presentations in class or final essays on contemporary film, right? But given the fact that I'm actually not a film critic, I never feel confident teaching them except as artifact, Yeah.
Thanks so much, Malcolm. Really interesting. Keri, I don't know if you want to add on to that. You are on mute.
I'll just add a few comments. First of all, I feel like I'm at the beginning of this work. Actually, when COVID took over our lives, I was just about to start a correspondence with some archivists at the Irish Film Institute to sort of start a conversation about who can we start bringing into the canon, especially women in Irish film. So there's an archival, I have an archival drive and a sort of drive to do that work that I have not done yet. But what I have done in my courses often, and these are not actually these are not films by Irish filmmakers, but by Irish American filmmakers filming in Ireland. I always teach Man of Erin, especially when I'm teaching Sing and sort of investigating the ethics of, you know, documentary and ethnography and everything to do with that. And also I've gotten very interested in Sydney Alcott's production company because Trinity College did a really amazing digitization of some of Sydney Alcott's films. And these are films where, you know, the production company went over from Hollywood to Ireland to make films for homesick Irish people, sort of romantic and sentimental films, and also, you know, things like adaptations of Boucicault, like there's a Colleen Bawn film. And so those actually are available online on the Trinity College website. And so that's a wonderful thing that Trinity did to sort of start that conversation. But as I said, I think I'm more at the beginning of this work, but I'm extremely excited about it.
Thanks. And there's two questions here which I think kind of relate to each other. The first is from Paul Kleiman, and he asks to Keri specifically, at what point does the adding content versus time available become unsustainable? You know, what then? I think that's something we can all be familiar with. But then also Patrick Hopkins is asking, you know, generally, like, are we in danger of making syllabi a little artificial by trying to make them more universal? So there's a kind of like a cost benefit sort of like way up here. So Keri, I might just come back to you first on that kind of like sustainability question, and then open out the second question to the panel.
Yes, I love that question. I fully feel absolutely. So even though I spoke in favor of, you know, the syllabus can fit everything, certainly I believe that the syllabus is more elastic and can fit more than we think. But yes, there have to be some, you know, at some point you're going to run out of time. They're just hours in the day. And often I've sat down and looked at my Irish syllabus and said, what is totally non-negotiable here? What could I never take off this syllabus? And I just thought about that again when seeing the question. And the three things that I could never take off, I think, are Eileen O'Connell's Lament for Art O'Leary, which is the most beloved work that I teach, and a work by a woman writer and a work from the Irish language. I could just never, that's a non-negotiable. I could never take off Joyce is the Dead, because the course does not work without it. Joyce theorizes everything. And I could never take off Oscar Wilde, because I just love Oscar Wilde. So I actually realized that some of the people who you would think are non-negotiable are more negotiable. So for instance, I don't have to teach Beckett every time I teach this course. I teach probably every second time I teach the course, but, you know, I don't have to teach Beckett to do what I'm trying to do. I think I have to teach less of Yeats than you might think. You know, I'm looking for the perfect way to teach Yeats. I love Yeats's poetry, but as I said, I feel like reading one poem extremely well may be enough for this course, given all the other things one is trying to do. And so I guess I would just end my answer by saying what we're really trying to avoid when we cram too much stuff onto a syllabus, I think, is a superficial skim. And you want students to have experiences of depth. So I think I would rather have them have that one class where we read among school children and we just read it, and just like that body swayed to music, brightening glance, we just really, really reflect, you know, for a long time on that. And then they've had an experience with Yeats, and then maybe we've lit the fire where they can now go and write about Yeats if that appealed to them, or, you know, pursue it on their own. But they know what it is. They know what Yeats offers at his best. So I think that, you know, we don't have to think so much in terms of coverage, like they have to read every poem by Yeats or see both the mystical Yeats and the national, like the questioning nationalism Yeats. You know, just have an experience with Yeats. I don't know, but I very much feel the question, and it's sort of constant negotiation.
Yeah. On the kind of universality kind of question then that Patrick Hopkins has raised, you know, I don't know what you might think of that, Anne, especially considering that kind of like, boundary kind of drawing that tends to be problematic in your own field. Like, what would your perspective on that be?
Yeah, I mean, I think of it kind of like a scale. I really, as I was trying to kind of explain in a way, I try to teach music as if it is like a material in the world that we all deal with, and there's so many materials in the world already. So in a sense, that is a very universal thing to think about, that music is just sound moving in time, and so are a lot of other things. But I guess I try and start from there, but then zoom into more specifics, because I think all of our disciplines can become very kind of categorized and kind of separated from each other. And I do think it's better to aim for something that connects rather than kind of differentiates all the time, that connects to the outside world in a way. That's how you get the more general public to be involved in your students' work when they go out and start making work themselves. You want people to get it, and that means that they have to be able to relate to a lot. They have to be able to relate their work to a lot of different things in the world, outside of the university, outside of the theatre or the concert hall. So it's almost a skill that you kind of have to move between, I think, between keeping things very kind of connected and then very kind of distinguishable as well.
Yeah. Patrick, I don't know if you want to come in on that point.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and it's one I think we all grapple with all the time. But I suppose a slightly glib answer is, like, the syllabus is always artificial. There is no kind of syllabus that is the right one. But to respond, I suppose, more open-mindedly to the question, I think, yes, of course, like if you're teaching Irish literature, you have to teach Joyce and Yeats, not least because people like Sally Rooney are in dialogue with them. If you get a music degree, you would expect to know Beethoven and Mozart and Wagner by the end of it, and so on. Like there are still the heavy hitters, the large figures that dominate there. But there are lots of ways of coming at these things. So, I mean, again, just something I tried this year when I did Shakespeare as part of a survey course for first year theatre history students. We looked at the Philida Lloyd Donmar Shakespeare trilogy, which is fully performed by an all-female cast, very ethnically diverse cast, coming from all parts of England, Scotland, and Ireland too, as it happens, in order to show that the canonical figures like Shakespeare can also be reauthored as a way of addressing in a very contemporary way the questions that we have about diversity and agency now. So I don't see it as I mean, the question of even universality, I think it's there's a lot of space in there for us to meet all of the different requirements we have.
Malcolm, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, and I think to Patrick's point and Kerry's points and Ann's points, I think these things also speak across these disciplines that I've been kind of raising, in terms of ecology and environment. So it is potentially possible to actually teach Shakespeare, for example, by really thinking about, this is Ann's word, about the material nature of the globe. The wood in the globe really isn't English wood, because there's a massive wood shortage in England. That wood is actually from Ireland, right? And so there are kind of ways in which Shakespeare becomes, quote unquote, important and for the future. And I think that's kind of one of the things that I use in terms of selecting texts and preparing syllabi. So a text I often teach is Kevin Barry's Fjord of Killary, right, the short story. And that is almost like an introduction to a Sing play, because it's all about the construction of the West, right? So rather than doing Sing first and Fjord of Killary later, I've kind of flipped it. But I think to Patrick Hopkins's point, there is, of course, a fear, right, of tokenism and totemism, especially when you kind of consider questions of race. So, Emma Dabiri's book that was kind of mentioned should certainly be in a modern Irish literature course because it is excellent. Do the other two books, that are written by people of color in Ireland, do they have to be included? That's a matter of it's a question, right? And then again, that also then brings up this question of gatekeeping, right? who do you, so who is granting the merit, to which particular author? So I think these are kind of complex questions, but I would say, as Patrick is saying, there are multiple ways of negotiating, these questions. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm aware that we're coming up very close to our time, so I might give the last word to Finian O'Gorman, who's asked a question to the panel, saying, to what extent should the canonical expectations of students be considered in curriculum design? I've received complaints in student evaluations in the past for including Marlowe instead of Shakespeare for the Renaissance portion of a survey course on theatre history, and I think we probably all have like a story similar to that to tell when we try and like shake up the boundaries of our own syllabi. So Keri, I might come back to you first on that if you don't want me putting you on the spot, but like, what would your thoughts be on that?
Sorry, I was muted. First of all, I was that student as an undergraduate. I remember I had a professor who was like all excited about new historicism. And instead of reading the 17th century poets that I was expecting to read, we were reading like agrarian history. And, I felt like I wasn't getting the sort of supposed quote unquote thing I signed up for as an English major. So I've been that person. It's almost like when professors are teaching sort of advanced graduate level material, but they're teaching it in an undergraduate class. That's kind of how it felt. I think that you do just have to, first of all, my students' canonical expectations have been less than I thought in my case. And I think it depends where in the university you're teaching. So if I'm teaching upper level English majors, then yes, I think those expectations are there a bit more. But when I'm teaching entry level courses in the university, for instance, to scientists and business students who are having their one experience with literature, I find that they don't have such expectations. And so, I can actually do more with those students. I think they're more interested in the contemporary and things that connect to the world that they know and those gateways. So thinking about where you are in the university and your teaching, but I think also in general, I just strive to create balance and just say, okay, let's spend a certain amount of the time making sure that you leave this course, and when you see a picture of James Joyce in an Irish pub, you can say to your friends, I know what that work is, so try to like create that. But then just, I like 50-50 maybe is what I've been doing.
Yeah. And I mean, there's no more kind of like canonical monoliths than there are in terms of like music and kind of classical music. So is that, an issue that you have to kind of consider in your own curriculum as well?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there are students who are very disappointed when, there's not a lot of Beethoven or Wagner or Steve Reich. Like I always have this, I generally teach music over the last century rather than more historical repertoire, but I do really struggle every year in terms of trying not to like teach about music style in terms of movements and overly categorizing people, but then you also need, kind of like what Keri was saying, you kind of really do want them to know what minimalism was, what new complexity was, what spectralism is. And it's really tough. Even when I taught minimalism last semester, I generally show a little bit of Steve Reich, some work by him, but I was like, but there's so many more interesting people to show in terms of minimalism now. And the BBC had this big documentary on minimalism, and it was literally all men. Like people renamed it MENIM, like minimalism, because it was like, well, because there's so many interesting female minimalists. So it's tough, but I often actually just explain that to the students, because they don't get the context sometimes, and so I try as much as I can in terms of what I'm trying to do with learning outcomes and with curriculum. I try and be straight with them, as in this is the story and you need to know it and be aware of it, because I think that's really important beyond their initial expectations.
Yeah. And Malcolm, might come to you next, because obviously there, you were talking about the kind of really specific kind of like modules and course options for your students, but I presume this still is an issue.
Yeah, I think it certainly is, and I think this was I've been a part of this kind of administrative task force trying to kind of revamp really the major, and we came up with these specializations. But certainly, I think one way to present it to the students would be to kind of present it in that manner of these little pathways that they could actually potentially follow, right? So even if, one particular poet or author isn't covered in a course, they might come up in another kind of section or a historical period or what have you. Yeah, certainly. I mean, that has been the case. There's also positive affirmation model that I often will kind of use, I suppose rewriting of classics become a way of teaching classics, for example, and that is something that I've been quite interested in. Also, in many ways, thinking about, let's say, feminist scholarship as environmental scholarship, right, is another way to kind of think about it. And indeed, if you think about the question of post-colonial studies in Ireland and the controversies about it, right, between the post-colonialists and the feminists and all of these artificial silos that people have constructed, I would say that the contemporary generation is really looking towards us to kind of break them down for them, right? Because it doesn't make any sense anymore, especially when, the future isn't going to be dictated by these internal wars, right? Somebody mentioned actually in the chat, in relation to the Irish language being a part of courses. I think that's kind of essential, and there's a shortcoming when it comes to the Irish language. Certainly in my case, and maybe many others, right, who are teaching Irish literature courses. But there are also ways to kind of circumvent that, right? There are processes of learning that the idea of pedagogy needs to undergo. So not simply in relation to climate, but actually maybe, something very simple like the conceptualizations of land, landscape, telluric kind of nature of soil in different contexts. So these are kind of areas in which I have kind of done some thinking about, like, what are the kind of Irish variations, right? And how do they in many ways compare to indigenous kind of vocabularies, right? In the American context, how does it compare to the Hindi variation that I would kind of know quite well, or the Bengali, right? And so in many ways, it's a matter of kind of reconception and also redefining what seems to have been inherently defined, right?
Thank you. And Patrick, I might leave the last word on this to you, and I'm sure like you'll have something to say about the idea of the Irish language and the kind of role it plays in, our own kind of teaching and learning, like, in the department, like NUI Galway being a bilingual campus and a bilingual organization.
Yeah, so, and I think language will become all the more important for us over the coming years. And I think what all of this shows me is that I think, the canon, to simplify, it won't change unless we start to change it. And I think we should be open to the fact that it can change and that our decisions do have an impact. As we've been talking, I found myself being reminded of my first year as an undergraduate in UCD and taking a drama survey course that had Shakespeare in it and had, all of the other canonical figures too, but also included Top Girls by Carol Churchill. And the course was given by Chris Murray and John Barrett. And Chris Murray was the person who lectured on Top Girls. And Chris Murray lectured on, a feminist approach to that play. And that at the time was seen both as unusual and as somewhat controversial. Now, the reality is now, it is unthinkable that you could not have Churchill on a drama survey course anymore. That's partly because of her own career, of course, but it's also because of the work of people of just putting her on there when it was something that had to be argued for. So I do think we have to see that and kind of anticipate that the teaching we're doing now, it's going to have an impact on the repertoire of the future, but also the future curricula, because amongst our own undergraduate students are future academics too.
Yeah. Look, folks, I want to say thank you so much for a really engaging session. I think we could probably sit here like well into the weekend and talk about it. So I want to say thank you to the audience who were active participants today, to our technical manager, Sarah Hoover, for keeping the show very clearly and comprehensively on the road. And of course, our four speakers, Patrick Lonergan, Ann Cleare, Malcolm Sen, and Keri Walsh. So if you want to do some more thinking about creative arts and the curriculum, you can do so again again next Friday. We have a second webinar called Shared Methodologies, Gender and the Creative Arts Canon taking place at the same time, and you can find the links on our social media pages and via our Eventbrite page. So next week we'll have Leon Bell, who is a set designer and also was kind of like the kind of like voice of Awakening the Feminist Movement, Dr. Karen Power, who's also a composer and also chair of Sound the Feminist Group, and myself, Ciara Murphy, and I'll be talking a little bit about my time researching on the Waking the Feminist and Setting the Feminist projects as well. So thank you so much to everybody, and looking forward to seeing many of you again next week.